Now today our speaker is Dr. Paterson, who will tell us about researching Launceston's 19th century hotels and some patterns that emerged. And Jay is a long-term member of this society, has published 3 local history books. She came from the mainland over 25 years ago and has worked at this museum and is a roving curator for Arts Tasmania. She's recently completed a PhD at UTAS on the movement of Tasmanians to New Zealand during the mid-19th century. So I'll ask Jay to come forward and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. As has already been mentioned in some blurb somewhere, this is not exclusively my project, so I'll start with a bit of background. This project has grown out of a great deal of research into the deliberations of the Launceston Licensing Board, which was undertaken some years ago by a young gentleman called David Radford. And it resulted in a very useful list of 19th century hotels in Launceston. Not complete totally, but it's been a very great research resource, which is in most of our libraries now. He also did a draft manuscript of chronological histories of selected premises. And now David moved to Queensland and left his manuscript with the Publications Committee of the Friends of the Launceston Library. And with David's permission, I agreed, also many years ago, to start reworking the manuscript with input and editing assistance from the always generously helpful Barbara Valentine, who I'm afraid is no longer with us. As you'll know, over recent years, there have been a couple of books come out about Launceston's hotels of the A to Z variety, as well as Anne Gunn's Places of Leisure in Launceston, which is part of the Stories in Stone series, and Melissa Watley, who was a volunteer at this museum. She's done a website specifically on our hotels, and both these latter resources have a lot of historic information and photographs. But we haven't really gone into that too much, don't want to plagiarise them accidentally. We'll look at them during the third and what I hope is the final draft of the book. Instead, I've worked through David's manuscript, additional research documents provided by Barbara, and because I can't help it myself, I've gone through Trove month after month, looking for all those little extra bits and checking references and fleshing out the human side of the story, which is what interests me the most. The Friends of the Library have asked for a book to be thematic, not chronological and not A to Z. And this approach does seem to be working. I'm now on the second draft. I'm on the halfway through the 6th chapter of 8 chapters altogether. It's hoped that this will prove an interesting and useful book for family historians who want some context for their 19th century publican forebears, how they might have lived their daily lives and the issues they were up against, both from the licensing laws and from attitudes within the community. The PowerPoint will show images of various hotels. Not yet everything that might be available. The final search for images and getting permissions for them will happen when the last chapter has been completed. I also apologise in advance for the quality of these slides. I snapped a lot of them myself, sometimes with great difficulty just as the rain was about to start, or the lights changed and then all the cars went rushing past the building I was trying to photograph. They're just here as an aid to memory because I'm sure you all know what our hotels look like. You can't exactly miss them. What I hope to do today is to tell a few stories that have come out of the extra research, aspects of being a publican that have either interested me or that appear to have a pattern in some way. But first I'm going to set at rest the status of Richard White as Launceston's first licensed publican. Many earlier historians have stated that he was probably the first, but all they could prove from the records available to them was that the Launceston Hotel was here in 1824. However, there are other clues in the historical records of Australia. There's a government inquiry from 1820, an interview with a man called Thomas Massey, who I think was a later publican himself, where he was asked, "How long has there been a licensed house in Launceston?" This was in 1820, and he replied, about 4 or 5 years. He then went on to say that in those 5 years, there'd been 3 hotels in Launceston, but by 1820, there was only 2 left. So White's original hotel was a 1-storey wooden building. We have that from early accounts, but this is its 1860s update. It's on Brisbane Street, obviously. Originally had the Quadrant Mall behind it and much more land besides. The whole block used for all the other services that White also supplied to early Launceston. So 1824 is the official date we started with, and then the wonderful Barbara Valentine came across a piece of primary evidence, which was White's memorial to the Governor-General, Colonel George Arthur. I'm afraid I've only got a scratchy little photocopy of this memorial and it didn't reproduce, so I'll leave this plaque there for you to look at, which commemorates Richard White and is in the Quadrant Mall. White's memorial to the Governor stated that Your Honour's memorialist, that's him, arrived here on His Majesty's brig Kangaroo in the year 1814 from Norfolk Island, since which time he has kept a house of accommodation under the name of the Launceston Hotel, which he sincerely hopes he has conducted with general satisfaction. So that's there in his own words. So now we have the date 1814 for his hotel, and to all intents and purposes, it does appear correct. We know that the Norfolk Islanders were resettled in Tasmania in 1813 and that White didn't accompany them. He stayed on with the government employees who were packing up Norfolk Island, and therefore he arrived in Launceston several months later in 1814. Now, Launceston at that time, when the Norfolk Islanders arrived, is described by other historians as a camp full of miserable hovels, only about a dozen dwellings, or with no activity of any kind, as Governor Macquarie was ordering the settlement back to Georgetown. So it's little wonder that no one had bothered to set up a hotel until 1814. I won't go into his personal history, which was very interesting. He brought his 2 to 3 year old son out with him, which was really unusual for male convicts. I won't talk about his relationship to the Clayton family, and then the very interesting things that happened to him when he went back to England for a trip later on, but you'll have to read the book for those. But suffice to say that this formal government document that Barbara found, and a trawl through the 19th century newspapers, which weren't available to these earlier historians, is where we find early settlers also corroborating this idea that he kept the first hotel in Launceston. One thing that interested me was all through the descriptions of Dickie White was the word eccentric. It turned up everywhere. It was the one word that they used to describe him. And I especially enjoyed a first-hand account from Edward Markham, who was a young Englishman who was travelling in the colonies. And he came to Launceston in August 1833, when White would have been about 60 years old. And he described him in these words. When we arrived, we put up at Dick White's hotel. He was a highwayman, for which they sent him across the water. He's a bandy or broken-legged mulatto, which of course we're not allowed to say today, and he plays the violin, and in addition to his inn is an auctioneer. And then he goes on to say, Dick White sat at the head of his table and is a decided character and wit. This is all we can see of the Launceston today, of course. I rather like this because it looks almost Parisian with these winter trees. And I think Marion told me that this facade was completed in 1903. Is that right? Yeah. Because of the breadth of his enterprise, his auctioneering business, his well, the pond he created for watering bullocks at, his pens for holding the animals he sold, as well as his stables and coach house, we're in a good position to move on to one of the other interesting aspects of being a 19th century public inn in Launceston, and something that's so easy for us to forget, and that's, of course, horses and the role of hotels as hubs of transport. As with the wharf hotels and their river and maritime names, there are many hotel names that reflected the century's reliance on horseflesh, such as the Black Horse, the Horse and Jockey, the Coach and Horses, and the Racecourse Inn. And they say that during the 1840s, it's believed that Launcestonians kept around 5,000 horses in the town itself, which is, I just imagine that today. So along with maritime traffic, of course, horses were an essential mode of long-distance transport until the railway came to Launceston in the early 1870s, which meant that hotels had to deal with horses. And in fact, the 1833 Licensing Act stated that any licensed person who kept an inn must be able to provide for both a traveller and his horse. Consequently, the majority of the hotels did have stables and carriage houses on their premises, and they had to take some care over it. I've come across complaints in the council records regarding the smell in areas like William Street, for example, where there were residences side by side with hotels and businesses such as blacksmithing. Too many horses could just foul up the road and what they used for footpaths in those days for people residing there. They opened up a range of business opportunities for licensees. I'll just mention the circus that you all have heard about. During the 1840s, George Radford of Radford's Royal Circus at the Horse and Jockey Hotel in York Street was the first truly professional circus to grace this corner of the world. This image is actually from Luke Agatti's book on Tasmania's early theatres, and it doesn't show the Launceston one. It shows what a upmarket British equine entertainment would look like. Obviously, ours was more basic. He describes it as being just wooden benches and that sort of seating. Unfortunately, in May 1885, tenders were called for the removal of this interesting building that we used to have in Launceston. The story of Radford Circus has been published in Way Back When, so I won't go into details. It's just gratifying to be able to mention a first like this when talking about Launceston's early hotels. For most hotel keepers, dealing with horses was just an everyday occurrence, though they did know how to value add, as we would say today. In 1829, John Pascoe Faulkner operated a vehicle hiring depot at what was then called his Cornwall House, later the Cornwall Hotel, which he advertised as horse and gig to let by day or journey. So hire cars are nothing new. Throughout the 19th century, we find many hotels looks so different from this angle. We find many hotel keepers were also men of extensive equine experience. For example, James Han, who in the 1840s ran various livery stables before becoming a publican himself, the licensee of the Plough Inn on Charles Street in 1848. Making a coach and stables and stablemen available to guests was only one step away from a publican expanding into running a coach service for his own benefit. So this is the Plough Inn, a few years after Han, with Walter Harris's name above the front window. This is from the QV Mag collection, and obviously a horse and coaches at the front door. I'll just mention, while this is on the screen, a pattern which creates difficulties when researching past hotels. Those of you who are old enough will realise that there have been several Plough Inns and Plough Hotels since the early days. In fact, the Galaxy in Brisbane Street, previously the Billabong, has only recently changed its name to the Plough Inn. So future historians will have another Plough to deal with. Publicans took their hotel names with them to new locations, or as in the case of Walter Harris, who was here then, a publican could move backwards and forwards. So he was at this Plough Inn twice, from 1857 to 60, and then almost 10 years later from 1868 to 70. And still not that simple, though, because the licensing board uses slightly different addresses every time you look at them allowing people to have their licences in the newspaper. So sometimes they will say this is in the street, and sometimes they'll say it's on a corner, and it's very hard to work out whether you're looking at a different building or not, because that doesn't look like it's on a corner at this stage, unless they'd taken over the building next door. There are many similar identification difficulties throughout the research. We'll just have to iron some of this out when we get to the third chapter, the third draft. Now, back to the advantage of a public house being the terminus for a coach service. This is just a list of Launceston hotels that were also coach offices, copied from the Launceston Examiner in 1851. You don't need to read the whole thing. It's just to give an idea of how the hotel and coaching businesses had developed in Launceston during the 30-odd years that it had been going. There were, of course, occasionally instances where a coach terminal did not confer distinction on the hotel it operated out of. In 1847, the Jolly Butchers on the corner of Charles and York Streets, not to be confused with another later Jolly Butcher, came in for quite a barrage of criticism, which was eventually put down to its location. Members of the licensing board believed that persons of bad character frequented the house. You hear this a lot. And it was a rendezvous for thieves and prostitutes. But generally, they also admitted that the York Street corner was a nuisance. In fact, at that time, York Street was fast becoming the undesirable centre of Launceston. A.D. Douglas, as the lawyer representing the licensee, pointed out that there always would be crowds collecting in that situation, as it was a starting place for coaches as well as the centre for auction marts. And in this particular case, the licence was refused on other grounds as well. but it was renewed at the next quarter sessions. And there was also a lot of that where publicans had to contend with losing their licence for short periods until they fixed a fence or did something. Obviously, for publicans, it made sense to not only provide the terminus, but to also be the coach owner. And quite a few publicans did this. Sorry, I'm going to need a drink. There's a bottle of water in my handbag, sorry. The coaching business was very competitive. Keeping good time was essential. Accidents could wipe you out, as it did for the brothers Bartholomew and Mannering Chitty, who ran the Infield Hotel on Brisbane Street near the Kingsway Corner. Thanks. Some of you may remember there was a wee history in the Examiner a few years ago. Bartholomew Chitty seems to have been prone to road rage, and the business came a cropper. So much so that it affected their hotel trade as well, which was possibly overcapitalised, and the Chitty brothers left Launceston for Victoria. But the big earners for publicans was not merely owning and running the coach, it was to take on the government mail contract. As Stephen Walker notes in his book on Tasmanian stagecoaching, it was the carriage of the inland mail which most affected the development of the stagecoach industry in Van Diemen's Land, and it made coaching especially viable for publicans. And there's a naked person in the top there. I noticed it after I'd photographed it. I looked up. It's actually a 3-year-old child that was naked and running around inside the room and sitting in the window. I just happened to be lucky. The Cornwall Hotel, previously the Batman Faulkner, as it is today, advertised by John Pascoe Faulkner in 1824 as being the only 2-storey house in Launceston, and this is where the word house is equal to hotel. It doesn't necessarily mean house. And also believed to be one of the town's first brick buildings. When John Cox and his wife Mary Ann bought the Cornwall Hotel from Faulkner in 1834, they brought their long-standing coaching business with them. Their government mail contract was estimated to alone be worth £1,300 a year, and the combined businesses of the coaching service and the Cornwall Hotel had an estimated annual turnover of £4,000, which was a very, very good income in those days. After John Cox died in 1837, Mary Ann took over the business, and even though she sold the Cornwall Hotel, it continued to be the base for her coaches. Mary Ann Cox is not Launceston's only example of a successful female publican and coaching entrepreneur. Now, the Coxes succeeded because they ran a dependable service, no flaring tempers like the Chitty brothers. Before the Coxes moved to the Cornwall Hotel, they had used Dickie White's Launceston Hotel as their terminus. John Cox ran the Launceston to Hobart service. He departed Hobart on Monday mornings at 8 a.m. and reached Launceston each Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. He'd been told that this couldn't be done. No one would be able to drive from Hobart to Launceston in 2.5 days. But the Cox did it, and they did it well for 17 years. Another successful 19th century publican was Henry Parr, who also provided veterinary services at his hotel. According to his obituary, he had been a successful farmer in the Westbury district before he came to Launceston, where he kept several hotels, one of which was the Royal Hotel in Wellington Street, still there, but now the office for the Memorial Church next door. Parr's obituary specifically states that he was an excellent veterinary surgeon, skilled in all the diseases to which all animals, from the horse to the dog, are liable. He was a very rarey. That threw me for a bit, but then Rarey was actually a 19th century American horse whisperer. So they had them back then. Parr was a very rarey for success in breaking and training horses, from the racer to the hack, and he was consulted by all classes of people, and he prospered without making any great show. He ran a string of racehorses as well, and even owned the Mowbray racecourse at one time. So publican business wasn't a bad one, really. Some of them did quite well. For Henry Parr, the serving of alcohol was obviously not his main focus. His hotels were described as more like comfortable boarding houses than drinking establishments. But what really interests me about Henry Parr is what was there. What I'd love to hear more about is his building of the Arcade Temperance Hotel. And yes, teetotalers do get a mention in the book. Actually, it was called the Arcade Temperance Hotel Livery and Bait Stables, bait indicating that food was also available for horses. And he built the arcade 2 years before he died, and it was in his son's name by the time it was viable, and his name was Arthur Parr. In 1876, the Examiner listed the arcade among Launceston's newest improvements, extolling the hotel's size, its bricks, and especially its artistic veranda. This hotel reflected the Pa's interest in horseflesh. It had 8 rooms for humans and 20 stalls for horses. It appears that carriages were tucked under the arcade effect in the front or in the side, and Arthur Parr also offered riding lessons, vehicles for hire, and access to horses for sale. I've included this photograph because our esteemed newspaper stated that the hotel was built on land in Paterson Street near the Examiner property. And matching this statement with the Launceston assessment rolls, this does appear to be the site. Unfortunately, though the Arcade Temperance Hotel is listed for 1878, by December the following year it's no longer featured in the rolls. So it was a very short-lived enterprise. In 1879, the site was described as a house, cordial factory and stables belonging to Walter Harris and Son, which then of course went on to be the Phoenix Brewery and Abbott's Cordials. Before the 20th century needed more land for car parking, so the car superseded the horse in more ways than one. As an aside, I'd just like to add in the pizza pub on Wellington Street. Many years ago, it also had a transport-related name, being known as the Elephant and Castle. The elephant being the moving part, and the castle being on top for riding in, also known as a howdah or a hoodah. This is another hotel which had its stables and coach house enlarged in the 1840s. In fact, refurbishment follows a very distinct pattern throughout Launceston's 19th century history. Regardless of who owned the various hotels, except for a landlord named Henry Redding, who owned many hotels and houses, and seemed to pride himself on never repairing any of his buildings. He gets mentions all over the place. He also gets mentions in Diane Cassidy's lovely book on prostitutes and brothels, which dovetails with the histories of many of these hotels, especially in the area of York Street. Mr. Redding aside, most of Launceston's hotels followed the pattern of adding new facades along with interior refurbishments, just like clockwork, every 20 years. There is another thing that can make identifying hotels difficult, as none of today's hotels remain in their original guise. Though the Examiner at the time did provide these wonderfully detailed descriptions of the interiors in their town improvements columns, and that does allow us to help piece some things together. But back to the Elephant and Castle. After its 1847 upgrade, when better facilities for horses were added, the hotel also operated a horse market, which makes me wonder whether the brickwork on the Frederick Street building beside, with those curves, might have been part of the hotel's equine accommodation. So I went in the back and had a look. It's difficult to see, and they've got all these footings along the bottom, so you have to use your imagination to try and imagine getting something through those doors. But one of the staff in the bottle shop did tell me that as far as they know, that was the stables. And then I went round the back and found that. So I'm going to go back and ask to be allowed inside and have a look. Somewhere around here in the yard of the Elephant and Castle, a poor man named John Jones was killed in 1876. He fell and struck his head on a stone while washing down a horse. And this is also covered in the book, but this is the only mention here of all this health and safety difficulties and troubles that people had to deal with in hotels. I had intended to show the 1942 postcard with an advertisement for blacksmithing painted on the side that used to be there on the Tamar Hotel, which shows that well into the 20th century, stabling and smithy services were still a feature of Launceston's hotels. But I couldn't find which disc I had it on. I've got so many discs and USB sticks. This is the Tamar Hotel, of course, still in William Street, still open to the public, operating again as a hotel, and that's where the James Bogue brewery tours leave from, and I always try and give them a plug. And because it's freely open to the public, it's worth going in and having a wander around. You can go upstairs and everywhere, because it's a great opportunity to see the layout of an 1841 hotel, because that's when it was built. That version of it was built. Brewery tours probably segue fairly easily into another 19th century service provided by hotels, and that was public entertainment. At different times, and with more or less support from the licensing board, hotels might provide some games like skittles, though gambling and cockfighting, of course, were not permitted. The mere sight of a stray pack of cards in a tap room could bring the threat of a fine, or worse, raining down on the publican. But what could the police do when the constable didn't actually see cops fighting, even though there were 25 men on the premises, on a Sunday to boot? This was in 1848, and the publican, Robert Redford of the Horse and Jockey in York Street, who also had the circus, he must have been very plausible, as he said that all 25 men were his employees, and that the 2 men with cockerels under their arms were merely feeding his best fowls and taking special care of them. In the end, the board got him on a technicality, because the back door to the hotel had been left unlocked on a Sunday. But he still managed to retain his licence. As well as the earlier games of skill, billiards, of course, became popular as hotels developed into bigger premises as the century went on, but that's another story. Hotels also provided rooms for many respectable meetings and dinners, and by paying for a special licence, dances and music might also be permitted for a set period. Though right up until the mid-19th century, hotels weren't encouraged to provide too much in the way of entertainment. Though certainly in Britain, by the late 1840s, attitudes were starting to slowly change, and the Cornwall Chronicle reported this in that year. New trends in England advocating that rational amusements provided by hotels might even improve society, and when managed properly, even repress vice. But with no theatres for legitimate dramatic performances, early Launceston was forced to rely on those licensees who were interested enough to create the space necessary and engage acting troupes to perform. Launceston's first theatrical season opened at Thomas William Massey's British Hotel in Wellington Street in June 1834, virtually on the corner with Balfour Street. I'm told it's where Dunnorland Terrace is now. This hotel boasted a ballroom, a saloon and a theatre, with the only room in Launceston big enough to have an exhibition of theatrical performances. The featured actors, who were Samson and Cordelius Cameron, had previously introduced the theatre to Hobart, so Mr. Massey didn't have to spend too much to get them up to Launceston. The Cameron Company also produced an important 3-act play at this theatre in October 1835. The play was called The Bandit of the Rhine. It was written by a Launceston resident, Evan Henry Thomas, and this is another first for Launceston. Thomas's Bandit of the Rhine is the first original single play wholly written and published in Australia. We didn't know that because everything I'd read before had said that it had happened in Sydney. When the audience called for the playwright to show himself, the Cornwall Chronicle waxed lyrical. The green curtain arose and our Tasmanian author stood in all the majesty of manhood, whatever that is, before the audience. Mr. Thomas boldly delivered an appropriate speech and the curtain fell again amidst thunderous applause. Now, this British hotel, we've read in medical histories of Launceston that in 1836 the hotel and its outbuildings were leased by the government and fitted up as a hospital, and that was the end of Launceston's very first hotel theatre. The British was soon superseded by other hotels as other entrepreneurial licensees attached theatres to their hotels. Up until 1857, when the Theatre Royal, which was our first permanent theatre, was built in St John Street. And around the same time, the Mechanics' Institute started presenting the less theatrical entertainments as well. And that spelt the end to hotels being the main theatres in town. But before the Theatre Royal was built, there were at least 7 hotels sporadically providing the Launceston public with their theatrical amusements. This engraving, also from the museum, shows the London Family Hotel during Feltham Bold Watson's time. That's between 1868 and 71. There's no hope of any of us remembering this hotel either. It was on the corner of Cameron and St John Street, where our lovely red brick post office is now, and has been for over 100 years. Between 1840 and 1856, this London tavern was Launceston's most successful hotel theatre. The well-known Benjamin Hirons established the theatre. He called it the Olympic, and later the Royal Olympic Theatre, and it was held in an upstairs room of the hotel. This was a very respectable theatre because in 1842, a performance was given under the exclusive patronage of the police magistrate, who was himself a member of the licensing board, and they were the ones who gave out the permits for these performances. The theatre was enlarged in 1842 because it was so popular, and because these hotels had to store bulky and elaborate scenery and props because of the exotic locations that were featured in these plays that were shown there. And they were all extra accoutrements that hotels were not designed for. Closer to home, though, one evening in July 1842 included a scene in the cave of the notorious Brady and McCabe, in which will be introduced the celebrated Song of the Bushrangers. So in 1842, Matthew Brady had been hanged 16 years before, so presumably in Launceston they felt it wasn't too close to home and it was now time to start including him in popular entertainment. And that brings me to the temporary exhibition of the Museum of Anatomical Wax Models in 1863. This was shown upstairs at the Courthouse Hotel on the corner of Wellington and Paterson Streets, where the fire station is now. There must have been some complaints, because even though the wax models showed different parts of the human body, both in health and disease, this advertisement stated that only gentlemen could see this, and it did cost $1, so that would have kept out the riff-raff as well. But despite all this, several days after this advertisement appeared, a notice went out that women were now allowed to have a look. So that was, not women, sorry, ladies were now allowed to have a look. And what better way to bring women licensees into the equation, especially because in 1863, when this exhibition was being shown, the keeper of the Courthouse Hotel was also a woman, Mrs. Mary Butterworth. Although she wasn't Launceston's longest-serving female hotelier, Mrs. Butterworth was an exemplary licensee, and this hotel was kept by her and members of her family for 44 years. And for 24 of them, her name was on the licence. The longest-serving female hotelier in Tasmania is Annie Huston of the Launceston Hotel. She's clocked up 50 years, but she's not really included because she took over in 1892 when her husband died, so she doesn't really fit the 19th century. Her story's a 20th century one. So there's the courthouse with its telltale corner door, a feature of virtually every hotel that was on a corner, with a space above the door for the obligatory lantern from the days when there was no street lighting. And when the courthouse, when the courthouse was diagonally opposite the road before the TAFE building was erected on that site. Mrs. Butterworth appears to have known what her clientele wanted. In her 1865 advertisement, she states that her accommodation is in the English style, which she is determined to offer for man and horse cheap, to suit the present depressed times. She goes on to say that dinner is £1.06, but you also got a free glass of Scott and Griffith's Superior Ale, and the brewery was just down the road on Canal Street. Horses were well fed and groomed at £3 a night, but you only paid £1 per horse during the day. Mrs. Butterworth also mentioned she would not charge extra for wedding parties, and anyone who's worked in a hotel knows what a mess they can make. And her advertisement ends with the fact that she's willing to take delivery of and store parcels for her guests. She was an astute businesswoman in other ways. Among her investments, she bought land in Wellington Street from the Henty family. She purchased 50 acres of land at Brandy Creek direct from one of the Daly brothers. And this was land, according to the paper, on which gold had been found, because, of course, Brandy Creek was later to become Beaconsfield. Mrs. Butterworth held on to her hotel licence until she passed away in 1880 at the age of 73, and the Courthouse Hotel continued to be operated by her children for another 20 years. Despite what we might think was the Victorian attitude to married women working, or women altogether, female publicans were not at all unusual in 19th century Launceston. I've mentioned previously on a talk about Williams Street some years ago that the Tamar Hotel was licensed for 150 years before there was a hiatus, before Bogues did it up again. And for exactly half that time, 75 years, a woman was running the business. It's interesting that very early on, women enjoyed a parity with men, actually in the legislation. In the 1826 Van Diemen's Land Licensing Act, the word person instead of he was used to describe the licensee of a public house, and person was used again in the 1828 Act, which regulated the sale of alcohol by retail. And there were worse things that could befall a woman than being the wife of a 19th century publican. On the whole, the licensing board saw a wife as necessary to the effective running of a hotel, especially in overseeing and maintaining the accommodation side of things, and generally as a civilising influence. A young man without a wife could even be refused a hotel licence purely on the grounds that he was unmarried. We have only one example of the board rejecting a potential licensee because of his wife, but that's very early in 1823, and the wife in question was a convict. It is also the only example found yet of the board directly discussing a person's convict status. There were times when members of the board might hint, but the others weren't going to go there. So it never really got discussed whether someone was a convict or an ex-convict. It was actually John Pascoe Faulkner's application for his brand new Cornwall hotel, because his wife was still a convict at the time. But when the board was notified that Eliza Faulkner was now a free woman of respectable report, her husband's application was successful. The licensing board's generally positive attitude towards women working alongside their husbands extended to them being very careful not to throw a woman and her children onto the street when a husband died. And in 1834, this right for women was enshrined in the Licensing Act, which meant that the hotel licence was immediately transferred into the widow's name without question, to allow her time to make other arrangements, find another husband perhaps, or if she chose and was considered suitable, she could continue on with the business herself. Of course, women weren't always society's panacea. There were also wives who drank, or who flouted the law, there were a few of those, or publicans' wives who were downright unpleasant people. But as in life generally during the 19th century, a good wife and children who worked alongside their parents were necessary to the viability of most hotels. Apart from publicans' wives and their children, there were other women, and men also, but I'm actually just talking about women here, who worked in Launceston's hotels without whom the larger establishments could not have functioned. And these were the maids of all work, who gradually specialised into barmaids, housemaids, kitchen hands, etc. Their daily lives were as onerous as for the male staff. As late as 1891, at the Exchange Hotel, which I think was in Paterson Street, barmaids worked split shifts for 15 hours a day, from 8 till 9, 10 to 1, 3 to 6, and 8 till 11. So between 8 and 11, basically. So it was 10 hours of actual work, with short periods between to do things like eat a meal, wash one's clothes, and clean one's room. Because, of course, you also lived on the premises, generally, if you were a woman. Fortunately, things gradually improved, and almost 20 years later, in the 1899 bill, it stipulated that a licensee could be penalised who employed any female in or about a licensed premises for more than 8 hours in any one day. And living in could have its inconveniences. Let's have a look. Female servants would rarely have got a room to themselves. They shared with other servants. That was the norm. None of the privacy that we expect today. In 1879, Mary Ann Hall, the 19-year-old housemaid and parlourmaid at the City Hotel on St John Street, this is a poor image, it's from the 1901 encyclopedia. The City Hotel, where Mary Ann did not even share with other servants, instead she had to share a room with her employer's daughter, which meant her landlady could wander in and out at will and go through her belongings. Something that told in Mary Ann's favour when the publican's wife rather suspiciously accused her of theft, and fortunately for Mary Ann, she was acquitted. I'm coming towards the end now, with 3 more photographs I'd like to show you. The first 2 fall within the context of tourism, which as the 19th century wore on became another string to the licensee's bow. Although the state government did not establish the Tasmanian Tourist Association until 1893, for many years our cool and invigorating climate, our sublime and picturesque scenery and English appeal had been attracting tourists to the state. One among many hotel keepers who jumped on this bandwagon as the century started to close was the proprietor of the that looks a bit squashed up. Well, the Esplanade Hotel on Lindsay Street, who advertised that arrangements could be made for patrons to visit the sites of the city and suburbs, along with visits to Lefroy and all the latest mining news. And the Esplanade performs much the same function today as a place to stay for tourists. This wonderful wooden building was a latecomer to our 19th century hotel world, starting life as church premises before almost immediately becoming a hotel, and all wood. Beautiful inside. Now, I'm rather pleased with this grainy newspaper image of the Federal Hotel at the eastern end of Brisbane Street, not to be confused with the Federal Coffee Palace, which was in Charles Street. This image just goes to show you can't find everything locally. Didn't have any image of this, but found this in a Melbourne newspaper in 1894. The newspaper had sent a roving curator and roving reporter and an illustrator to do an extensive feature on our fair city. The article described what was expected of a tourist hotel, which was no longer simply about a drink and a bed for the night. Instead, the hotel must embody quality and offer health as well as comfort, and with particular bonuses like those of this hotel, a good garden and being positioned above the noise of the street. This hotel also featured a lookout on the rooftop, from which visitors could see magnificent panoramas, the winding Tamar stretching for miles ahead, a steamer slowly rounding the sharp points in the stream, the wattle-fringed banks, etc., etc. Lovers who climb up to this lookout will not want to leave it until the dinner bell sounds. The Federal Hotel looked like a private mansion instead of a hotel, and that's essentially what it was. Unfortunately, for us, while some of its neighbouring end-of-century villas still survive, mostly hidden behind the modern hotels which front onto the eastern end of Brisbane Street, this Federal Hotel is no longer there. So that's the only image I've found so far. It was a rare exception within Launceston's hotel history because it was originally a lodging house called the Parkview Hotel until 1886, when its owner, Charles Williamson, went to the licensing board because he found it necessary to have a bar for the convenience of visitors during the summer season. So this is the only hotel I've found that started off teetotal and became licensed. And that was when the name changed to the Federal Hotel. He eventually brought in a Melbourne publican to run his hotel and hobnob with the visiting mainlanders, a man sometimes known as John and sometimes Michael Germain, who appears to have been successful in Launceston, not only with his hotel but also in finding husbands for his many daughters. Unfortunately, Germain stayed barely 3 years. He used his Launceston experience to return to a better job in Victoria in 1895 and take over the even more glamorous beachside Mentone Hotel. The following year, the owner closed down the bars, he found a respectable tenant, and it became the Parkview again, and it was originally put on the market in 1904, and the family moved to Sydney. Now this one is another story. And to end, on the table, I've laid out some images that have been passed on to me for use in the book if we need them, and which in turn I am then to pass on to a collecting institution when we're finished with them. They are photographs of drawings of some Launceston hotels made by the Hobart-based artist Andrew Thomas Fleury, who arrived in Tasmania as a boy in 1870 or around then, and is buried in Cornelian Bay in 1947. These may have been photographed in the 1930s, when we know that the Southern Tasmanian Photographic Society was reproducing his drawings for an exhibition in Hobart. But I don't know whether he drew these in Launceston or whether they were drawn from photographs or newspapers. Any information would be welcome, as I need to properly confirm the identity of some of these hotels, and especially where they were in relation to the streets that are named on them. For example, is this one the Hibernia Inn or the Hibernian Hotel, or both, which is listed both as being in Brisbane Street and then later as being on the corner of Brisbane and Bathurst Street? In which case, this is the Irish Today. Is it this one? Because the facade is, this is obviously a modern facade, but if you look at half of it and assume that that bit on that side closest to Dunn's is where it extended, then the smaller hotel would fit easily within this facade, because there's 5 windows upstairs that match, and that door in the centre and what would have been the end of the smaller building are in the same places. So I'm trying to get inside that one at the moment so I can see how the walls match up inside. If anyone can add anything to this research or can comment on the photographs laid out on the table, I'll leave my mobile number up on the screen. There are many aspects of our 19th century hotels trade I haven't mentioned, such as their role as morgues, which went on for years because the council was very deleterious about building a city morgue. The maritime and railway hotels, crime, both by licensees and by members of the public, and the behaviour of the licensing board itself. But I think I'll leave you there. And thank you very much for listening to this work in progress.
Stay up here for a minute. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Jay. That was absolutely wonderful. There's a lot of research I can see crammed into that. Can't wait for the book to come out. We don't know when that's going to be.
No, I have a life as well.
You do. Yeah. So thank you very much, and there's a little gift from us.
Oh, thank you.
And now, are there any questions from the floor?
Possibly it is. I'm not very good on that A to Z, began here, begat, and this is the last publican. I'm not very good at that because that was what David did. So that was what David Radford did. That was his research. So once I've written all this social history stuff, I will be going back to him and saying, now we've got to match all these dots up, with your research. So that we can give the friends of the library the book that they actually wanted. Yeah.
Jay, interesting about the pizza.
Yes, I know.
It appears that one of my good friends is related to the Hardman and actually owned that. And he was where Myers was as well, on the double-storey theatre that was there. And so he's directly related. It was one of the first, I think, Hardmans here in 1832.
Yes, I've got something about the Hardmans somewhere else, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I'd be interested in that, Gus, yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, meeting up with people, anybody who's got, forebears that relate to this story would be great, because those little private bits are the lovely bits in these sorts of stories. Yes?
I just wondering if you found much information about the use of the early hotels as meeting places for fraternal societies, and if they had dedicated facilities for doing so?
Yes, the assembly rooms that were built, like when you're down the side of the old Batman Faulkner, the Cornwall Hotel, you can see the add-ons that have happened over the years.
Yeah.
And then there's stuff in the legislation about when people wanted to have them for clubs to use, some of these assembly rooms, and they were putting billiard tables in there. Well, the licensing board didn't like that because they got so much per year for the licence for every billiard table you had in the pub. But if you started putting them into the assembly rooms, they weren't getting any money for them, so they had to put doors between and block pieces off and all this sort of thing to get around that legislation. So yeah, there's bits about that sort of thing. Yeah, and also the dinners. They had wonderful, Scottish dinners, Burns nights and things like that in some of the hotels. Huh?
I'll just check with our online audience to see if we have any... no questions online, so is that everyone from the room?
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you again so much, Jay. That was just wonderful. We can't wait for the book to come out. The library, the Friends of the Library are planning to publish that at some point. So thank you all for coming today, and we'll see you again on the 18th of September, I think it is. So, and on the Scrimshaw cane from the Oatlands Guardhouse. So thank you very much.